I was sad to hear that Tony Horwitz died suddenly on May 27th, at the age of 60. He was a New York Times and Wall Street Journal reporter who was known for embedding himself in the worlds he wrote about, as the New York Times put it. His stories about working conditions in low-paid jobs like garbage recycling and poultry processing won him the Pulitzer in 1995, and he also immersed himself in the subculture of battlefield reenactors for a 1998 book called Confederates in the Attic, Dispatches from the Unfinished Civil War. And it was just about 2 weeks before his death that I talked to him about his latest book, which grew out of that experience and his desire to retrace the steps of someone who also wrote for the New York Times. You might not realize this, but Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park and about 19 Seattle parks, including, let's say, Green Lake and Woodland Park, was a correspondent for the New York Times and paid an undercover visit to the southern United States to see what it was all about. And now Tony Horwitz, who has served as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and the New Yorker, has decided to retrace Frederick Law Olmsted's steps in a book he's titled Spying on the South. So why did you decide to do this?
Well, one, I was interested in Olmsted, this remarkable and peculiar genius who came to his great career as a landscape architect by a rather circuitous route that included going south on the eve of the Civil War to write for the New York Times. And this is really what leads him in a roundabout way to his ultimate career. And I was also struck by the parallels between his time and our own. I don't think we're on the verge of a civil war, but we're certainly at another very polarized moment in our history. So I thought his mission of trying to essentially cross the American divide was a worthwhile one for this moment.
Right. Olmsted's journey was in the 1850s during the run-up to the Civil War. So well, give us a thumbnail of where you went.
Right. Well, I really tried to follow very closely Olmsted's path. He actually took two journeys, and I followed his second one that began in Maryland and goes across Appalachia, along the Ohio River, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and across a great deal of Texas. So that was the real body of my trip, mostly in rural areas and small towns, though a few cities, and needless to say, often quite different from what Olmsted saw in his day when some of this territory was really the frontier.
And I'm guessing you found it was not a monolith, as many of us up in the north think it to be, but what was your big surprise during your tour?
Well, yeah, I think, there was never one South. It was never a monolith, but that's particularly true today. There's just been so much demographic change, for starters, in recent decades, immigration from abroad, from other parts of the country. So it's, a city like Houston is now the most ethnically diverse in the nation. You have pockets of every population imaginable. So I think the sheer variety of the South and its many subcultures, whether you're talking about Cajuns in Louisiana or Germans in Texas, is really the story of America.
I spent 4.5 years working in Atlanta, and it surprised me. This was in the early 70s, because I had assumed that the Civil War was ancient history. And in fact, it was not in Atlanta, and I was still considered a Yankee. It was the first time I've been called a Yankee, and have it not be referenced to a baseball team. So, so today, you coming in as an outside reporter, did you engage in debates with people?
Oh, absolutely. That's what I do. Well, not specifically debate, but I wander around as Olmsted did, meeting strangers, often in the evening at bars, at taverns. And yeah, sometimes I would have outright debates, but more I was interested in listening and learning, and didn't, can't pass for a Southerner, was open about being a liberal Yankee who lives in Massachusetts. But I found that, on a personal level, we can still sit down and talk over our differences in a civil manner, which we don't do as a rule on social media. Or through watching programs that stereotype each other. So I think there's great value in simply getting out there and meeting people who may not agree with you on many issues.
And so what was the most divisive issue that you discovered in your travels?
Well, I was traveling really in the run-up to the 2016 election, and obviously there was a lot of talk about a border wall. I would say immigration was a hot topic just about everywhere, and I ended my travels, as Olmsted did, at the Rio Grande, right on the border. So that was certainly a pressing issue. And in the South and in many parts of the country, gun rights, of course, is a divisive issue. And, at times it is a little reminiscent of the 1850s in that there doesn't seem to be much room for compromise on issues, such as guns and particularly abortion. There's really no middle ground. And, that's a dangerous situation.
Yeah. Guns and abortion, that's going to be a tough one to solve. But on immigration, as you point out, Texas is a very diverse state. Mm-hmm. Did anyone you talked to say, look, if they would just do this, I would go along with it?
Yeah, actually, Texas has a more nuanced position. I mean, I can't speak for, a state with 27 million people, but it's been a mix for a very long time, this sort of Tex-Mex mix, particularly in the southern half of the state. And so they're accustomed to that. They take pride in that. It's essential to their economy, their diet, really their language. So certainly, you meet people who are, wall them out. But there were many others who said, let's find some middle ground here. So I think Texas is perhaps more open-minded on that issue than might be the case in other red states.
And what would that middle ground be?
Well, that's the problem. We seem to be unable to find it, but, something that's sensible and humane, and that isn't simply building a wall, which Texans also recognize. It's not going to work. When you see the border, it's a floodplain. It's private land. It's just, as one person put it to me, it would be like building a castle on sand. So it also just isn't realistic to the situation at the border.
I mean, because the solution seems simple to somebody like me. The Americans are not reproducing. We obviously need more young people. The people who are coming across the border are mostly young families who are physically able to do and willing to do whatever you want them to do. Why not raise the legal limits on immigration? Let people apply in their home countries. When they pass, tell them, hey, this is your ticket into the country. You don't have to have refugee camps or anything like that. We know who's coming in, and we know they can support themselves, and we let them in without trying to keep the immigration levels artificially low and creating a 14-year-long line to get in.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we've always been a nation of immigrants. When Olmsted is traveling, he lives in Staten Island in New York, where at the time about 40% of the population was foreign born. And he went to Texas, where people were flooding in from all over, from abroad, from other parts of the U.S. So, we also seem to have lost sight of that. A few of us are more than a few generations removed from, an immigrant from somewhere. But I think many people feel threatened culturally, really, as much as they might economically. I think it's a very emotional issue, this sense of losing their sense of what America is. And I think this isn't necessarily subject to rational debate. It's a very emotional issue.
But again, going back to Texas, talking about what America is, Texas was owned by Mexico. So the Mexicans had it first, and the Americans basically flooded in and took it over. But Spanish has always been spoken there, and one of the main objections, the cultural objections that I keep hearing from people when this first started was, I don't want to have to press one to speak English. English should be the default. I mean, but the Texans have been speaking Spanish for centuries. Why would that be a big deal, especially there?
Uh-huh. Well, I think, as I said, I think there is a more nuanced view there. But, we're in such a polarized moment that if you're a Republican and this is where your party is at, you're supporting them. You're not going to support the other side. And, that's where we seem to be at on so many issues. If they're against it, I'm for it. Or if my man is for it, then so am I. And, it's this almost tribal allegiance we seem to have developed that, it just drives us further apart. And we seem almost incapable, or certainly our political system, of finding middle ground and taking effective action.
Did the people that you encountered have stereotypes about you being from Massachusetts, a highly educated Massachusetts journalist?
Sure, absolutely. And, these things don't go very deep. I mean, many people have stereotypes about Southerners. And when you sit down and start talking, you realize you have a lot in common. But yes, they assume everybody in Massachusetts is a wild-eyed liberal. So they'd be surprised to learn that, many of my neighbors are gun-carrying, Trump supporters. They think that, we're all sneering at them. All sorts of assumptions of who I might be and how I might feel about them. But I didn't find it hard to dispel those stereotypes. And again, I think it's the value of getting out there and having contact in that way is, if nothing else, maybe it lowers the temperature a little bit and makes it harder for us to demonize each other, because they're not seeing some Fox-induced bogey of a coastal elite. I'm the guy on the next bar stool.
So it sounds like you would recommend that whether you're writing a book about it or not, everybody should visit a region of the country they don't understand and just talk to people.
Absolutely. And, it doesn't even have to be a separate region. I mean, we're also very divided between rural and urban, and between, yes, coast and interior. So, I don't know Washington State well enough to know what to recommend, but, you don't have to go to the other end of the country to get outside of your precinct, whatever that might be.
Yeah. Well, here in Washington State, really all you have to do to get to Texas is cross the Cascade Mountains, and that's kind of how it feels. And I think a lot of this divide has been artificially ginned up, probably by journalists like us, because we like conflict. But I've never sat down, and because I will debate people who disagree with me as often as I can, either by email or just meeting them over lunch. And it's always been friendly. Once you get beyond, once you get out of uniform, so to speak, right, and just talk to each other, things go pretty well.
Agreed. And I don't know that we necessarily change each other's minds when we have those kinds of conversations. But I think there's still value in having them, and simply sort of shouting at each other through bullhorns from our respective bunkers only deepens, the divide. So I think, making that effort is a start.
So did you come away with any overriding lesson beyond that it's a good thing to talk to people?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I cover a lot of territory in this book, and I was trying to see it through Olmsted's eyes as well. So, I saw a lot, or learned a lot, about how he felt about landscape and society, and his remarkable forward vision that I think we can learn from. Colleagues called him long-headed because he was always looking, far into the future of how a park would look 40 years from now. And I think we've lost that sense of vision. We're shrunken headed by comparison in this, tweet driven times we're in. And also, the value of planning and aesthetics. I mean, to me, one of the saddest things often in traveling America is the sameness of the landscape and the uglification of it. Yeah. The sprawl that makes every city look like any other. And I think Olmsted would be horrified by that, that we've allowed that to happen to this, beautiful land.
Yeah, that was the reason that he liked to design parks. He saw them as places where different people could meet and get to know each other.
Yeah, and this is what interested me about his Southern journey. It's an unlikely route, but it's really in the South that he develops this social vision of public spaces like parks, bringing people of all backgrounds together, really as a rebuke to the feudal, slave-based society he saw in the South. He wanted to create these spaces that would show the strength and promise of a free and democratic society. Really to lead by example. So that was a big part. We look today as these just peaceful green spaces, but he was much more ambitious than that. He really saw these as tools to bring Americans together.
So it sounds like the bottom line here is visit a public park and save democracy.
Yeah, well, those are good ambitions. Visiting a park is certainly easy, I hope, and appreciate the people around you as well as the trees.
Tony Horwitz's book is titled "Spying on the South." Tony, thanks very much.
Thank you, and looking forward to coming to Seattle again.